Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. High test versus low test. Which should you be escalating in your cycle design? Luke and I want to cover the pros, the cons, the what to do in this dilemma that we see many people are faced with. Luke, how are you doing? We're shooting this episode. It is Merry Christmas Eve. Of course, it'll come out past Christmas, but either way, Merry Christmas Eve.
Yeah, and we were thinking of this topic for today because we wanted to be so generous in giving you guys the gift of gains and the gift of gains without side effects. And I think that that's kind of the big conversation to have around, why is testosterone the focal point in stack design, and how are we going to use this as a way to drive progress, and which side of the spectrum do we fall, or is there a side of the spectrum do we fall, to be found out when it comes to high tests or low tests. So the gift of gains is coming today, and I'm super excited for this. I think it's a highly debated topic with some not objective assessments of like what's actually should be done. So I think that that's kind of the piece to cover today, but I'm super excited for this. It's a good topic.
Yeah, with testosterone, it's, now it's nearly well recognized it's going to be a base to your cycle design. It's the starting point. And really, even with, if you had low testosterone, a lot of people kind of is their gateway into using TRT and then going nowadays above and beyond TRT. We talked about this. The enhanced lifestyle is now a thing in a previous episode, but testosterone being a bioidentical hormone, your body is well equipped physiologically to handle with it. And also the biotransformation of this testosterone into estradiol, which is important for a number of functions of the body, is also well needed to balance out the androgen effects. And these kind of oppose one another, but the reason why bringing up testosterone levels, if you are low, the benefit around that actually is a lot of it circulates around bring up estradiol in turn, because if you are blocking estradiol and keeping testosterone in place, you remove a lot of those benefits around the neuroprotective aspects, the cardiovascular protective aspects around bringing testosterone up. So it's really estradiol which has a lot of the protective pieces around it. But that's also about gains too, because if you also see blocking estradiol with testosterone using like an AI in very low amount of estrogen, you see lower IGF-1 and growth hormone levels in turn. Also you can see like greater propensity for body fat gain as well. So estradiol has a role in glucose and fatty acid metabolism. And also its role in just blood vessel elasticity and health. You might have less pumps in the gym. So that has roles in of its own of being like an anabolic compound. Then we also have DHT, which comes from testosterone. So if you were devoid of testosterone, you use a certain amount of DHT, which is the masculizing effects of testosterone. Now, as we get into this conversation, we'll talk a little bit more about why that might not be as necessarily needed, but testosterone from a health standpoint in men is the baseline and is why it's always been the starting point for cycle design as well, as you're physiologically equipped to manage this compound. I think probably if we looked back in the day, there was like nandrolone only cycles because that's just what was available. I think a lot of guys would just use like Deca, and there's like Dianabol around, and that's just what you use. So I think it's just more of that's the case. And we've seen some of that transition to like modern bodybuilding. You hear about the nandrolone only cycle, but really I don't see any cycles around now that just don't have any a degree of testosterone present.
Yeah, it's not as common as you may have ran into 4 or 5 years ago, in my opinion. I do think one of the interesting things, especially with like the DHT side, is like we've built a lot of content around pros, cons in that. I've got some social media content on it and a lot in the level 1 module. But would you tend to say that when we start to look at this from an objective physique analysis standpoint, the idea of high test is a bit of a romanticized topic, and potentially comes from a lack of an understanding of the benefit / detraction of test at varying levels for these athletes and kind of how to manage that appropriately, in the sense that to me, the days of high test with AI/SERM usage alongside it is still very much present in our industry. And I think it's, like you mentioned, something that's romanticized with potentially not enough understanding behind it.
I think it's very easy to get bought in and biased towards what you're initially introduced with in bodybuilding and where you saw a lot of results. Like for me, I absolutely would have run high test earlier on, and I got a lot of results from it. So it'd be really easy if someone out there was saying, hey, you need to run this low test and this other compound along with it, for me to get, abrasive and defensive, as it's kind of dismissing what I've done and my results that I've seen. So I think that can easily be done. You need to at least remove a bit of the emotional bias away from it, that these are just utilizing compounds for a means to produce a result, and not attacking anyone based on like your religion of high test or low test. And that's not, I think that's how you should stay open-minded. And this goes beyond just cycle design into training philosophies. You have like the failure versus non-failure group, or high volume, low volume, or carnivore, vegan. Like it becomes now like your culture and your religion nearly, which it shouldn't be. Like these things are just tools to be utilizing. So I think it can be, and you hear the fun phrase like test is best. And I think too, you can have some bias from what you notice on a high test cycle with a large drive up of water weight. And so, and even with some of these other compounds too, like the nandrolone cycle, and we have to realize, like, what are we really using this for in bodybuilding? I think that's where you have to really differentiate cycle design, is that we're not designing cycles for powerlifters. And for one, like increasing body weight could improve leverages. However, the main role of these androgens is to accrue muscle tissue, like muscle protein synthesis. So like the strength aspects, the water aspects, like a lot of this is just, it's just fluff weight. It's not contributing actual contractile weight. And there's problems with that too, of like driving up more water, makes you have more blood pressure potentially to have to manage. More body weight equals potentially a harder time training, because you have more to move, which cardiovascular might tax you more. Poor sleep could be an issue too, of being at a higher body weight. And once you stop the compound, water drops off and you're left just with your contractile muscle gains, which once you kind of, sort that, it might not be that different gain wise in these other compounds that we'll talk about. And then the strength aspect too, which it can't be denied. I think once you get to a certain point with testosterone, the DHT piece really drives a lot of the strength gains that you notice. It's why, like in powerlifting, a lot of the drugs they utilize are DHT derivatives. There's some role there in driving more strength and neuromuscular adaptations, or acutely even. And you have to differentiate between, like, is strength coming up from actual muscle gain, or is it from this neuromuscular aspect? And just because you're like driving more strength doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be gaining more muscle. And I would just add to this is, like, you don't want to have to be a strong bodybuilder. Like, you don't want your cycle design to make you stupid strong. You will have to get strong by adding muscle. Like, this is a necessity that'll take place. However, you don't want to chase it down with your cycles, because getting stronger is just a much harder body build to manage from an injury perspective, from a contest preps perspective. So yes, you'll need to get stronger, and that's something that we're going to have to make sure happens, but we don't want to drive those adaptations to a fast degree without the muscle gain coming along with it. So I think there is a lot of romanticism around testosterone, because it can make you feel bigger in the off season. It can make you feel strong in the off season, but we just have to make sure is that actually leading to a muscle gain, contractile muscle gain, that differentiates from a different cycle design.
Yeah. And I think conceptually, for the audience to kind of understand, because we're living in a little bit of a wishy-washy space currently, and we're going to clear some of it up as we go through, but all of this starts to live in spectrums, right? Spectrums of the amount of testosterone that's used within cycle design, the spectrums of how much progress you elicit from hypertrophy relative to the amount of strength. And all we're trying to do is move you through the portion of the spectrum that maximizes your progress. So, like, for an understanding on the strength front, it's not that we don't want you to have a progressive stimulus, progressive overload, and get stronger. It's just that if you focus so much on maximizing the strength component of that training design, you're potentially leaving out progress on the hypertrophy relative to the unit strength that you're increasing. When we switch that into like the PED world, it's not that test is the base or using increased levels of test or increased totals of levels of milligrams or androgen load is not going to increase your progress, but it's the same component. It's like, how can we elicit the maximal amount of hypertrophy per the minimal amount of input so that your glass ceiling of progress is increased over the long term, and then that lives across the spectrum. And so I think that kind of starts to bring us into some potential pros and cons of like high test and versus low test, and kind of what are the pros and cons of that. And for me as a coach, the reality, the differential between the theoretical on paper stack design that we can talk about versus the reality of access and coaching the N=1 for the athlete is the fact that test is a cheap option and test is a very readily available option as a prescription at multiple different pharmaceutical clinics, which makes my job so much easier in regards to using it as a big portion of that stack design.
Yeah, definitely. If you're starting out earlier on and without a lot of finance, testosterone is extremely cheap, and it's not going to be faked. You might have underdosed, but it also, for like sourcing underground, it is likely going to be what it is. However, there is farm grade available too, and that's more readily available now as well. Or we have some people that are sourcing some from their clinic and then supplementing a little bit of UG test on top of it. So for a number of reasons, this reduces risk. If you can get something that you know it is what it is, that creates less risk for shot management. Volumes for one, testosterone usually comes to 250 mgs per mil, and then also from a just an injection safety standpoint, not having to use an underground compound that could have sterilization problems, right? So risk reduction already is a pro for testosterone along that lines. There is the issue, though, with testosterone that at some point raising that dosage up, you're going to have to manage estradiol. And so this becomes the problem around it. And some people, that stop point is going to be sooner than for others. And the other thing that you can bring in then is the AI. And we see a lot of cycle designs where test and AI could be taken pretty high dosages. So I think early on in a bodybuilding career, going all the way up to 500 milligram for some people of testosterone is very, very doable. A lot of people live in that 300 to 400 mg spot before they need to either use an AI or bring another compound in. Now, the testosterone only cycle, if you're needing the AI, the pro there is that the AIs are also very cheap and also very readily available, even with farm grade. So you can pretty much keep someone on a nearly farm grade only cycle of testing AI for a good duration of time. Now, the con around that is that also it's a pill to have to remember. And a lot of times we're rotating like every day or every 3 days. You think like, hey, if you remember shots, you remember your pills, but that just doesn't happen sometimes. Also, it can be a little harder to make sure you get to your estradiol sweet spot. So say you're raising up testosterone, you're at 400 milligram, you notice like, oh man, like I'm getting a little bit of nipple sensitivity or sleep's getting a bit deranged. And so you put X dose of an AI in and it lowers you, it removes that symptom. But did you lower it too much? How do you know? Then you pull labs, and these labs have errors within them too. And so you won't know if you're actually fully optimized or not. Like you might have a sensation of like, okay, I feel pretty good. And for a lot of people that is enough, but we might overly skew it, especially when we're seeing people that don't pull like an ultra sensitive estradiol panel. And so you might be now creating cycle designs that are removing a lot of the benefits of estradiol that could be present. And I think the overshoot is much easier with that type of cycle layout. But that's not to say the ideal thing here is whichever route you go, just getting to the estradiol sweet spot. So that is via an AI using the minimal dose needed and then raising testosterone up in accordance from there. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the offseason? Upgrade your coaching game with J3U University. Our program covers everything from offseason to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Yeah, the interesting question around this is like, and I'll pitch this to you just to take a quick take on it, is because I got asked this earlier, is once you go through that experience of test only and potentially seeing that you have to manage it with AI at a certain dosing, is it even worth running that again, or is it worth bringing in the other compound to reach those total milligram amounts again or slightly higher? My answer to this was I would be bringing the other compound in to not have to run the AI alongside it. But would you tend to agree with that? As far as like you do cycle 1, you see kind of you get to 400, 500 or wherever you get to, and you have to bring in the AI. Round 2, where do you go?
Yeah. Well, I think you're reaching a stop point pretty quickly with the test AI only. And at some point, another compound has to come into play. So
yeah, that's what I said too.
Right. So whether you want to continue the test AI route, you kind of know where your test can sit with that amount of AI, you could leave it there, but you're probably likely having to bring in the other compound anyway. The kind of devil's advocate thought process here is like the question mark around what about DHT? And so, you know, you have this combo here. We have your test and AI present. Well, if you block, for instance, if you're taking a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor like a finasteride, those individuals could be more susceptible to gynecomastia. Why is that? Well, testosterone funnels down to DHT or estradiol. By blocking conversion DHT, you can send more down the estradiol path. So those taking finasteride might be more susceptible to gyno. They might handle less estradiol in turn. So they might not be able to get their tests as high. Very well, the same can go for if you're blocking estradiol, more can get pushed down the DHT path. So using the testosterone AI cycle dose, you might be creating a more androgenic profile to your cycle design comparatively to where if you kept test at that same dosage without the AI and bringing in a DHT derivative, while that DHT derivative also won't be able to convert to estradiol and cause some interference with test converting, but it does the same thing to 5-alpha reductase and DHT conversion. So you very likely might be creating a less androgenic profile for you, which as you get to higher higher dosages, that might be beneficial, especially now when you see a lot of guys like, hey, Luke, I'm worried about my hairline. I'm worried about my skin, etc. Well, if anything, DHT potentially has one of the greater inputs over every compound to propagate that more. And so if you're able to lower the DHT amount in that cycle design, especially as you're getting to higher androgen levels, this could be a little bit more hair skin friendly. But nonetheless, you know, with higher androgenic cycles, that's where most of your side effects come from. Like you want just muscle tissue accrual. You don't want stimulation of androgen receptors all over the body. You really just want it on muscle tissue. And that's what you're doing with DHT without any other benefits for muscle building. Like the DHT doesn't have that specific role. So this is kind of the issue with using just like the test AI combo. That could be a problem. But as you bring in other compounds, likely you're reaching the saturation point for 5-alpha reductase that you're not going to get any more DHT anyway. So this is kind of like the weighing out of options there of like, well, which do you do? Like which could be best? And it's like, well, there's just a pro and con along to it, because I'm sure you've had clients, Luke, that they tolerate such a low amount of testosterone. Like some guys that can't even get over 200 milligram. And they're like, well, we would love to just use primobolan as a great second compound. Oh yeah. Well, I only get 100 mg per mil and I need over a gram. So now I'm looking at 200 mgs of test and then over 1,000 milligram per week of primobolan. Like I can't afford that. I can't handle the shot volume of that. What do I do? Can I use, is that a situation to use an AI?
Potentially. I would tend to go down the route of Master on E as my first shift rather than going the AI, because we can get Master on E pretty readily available at 200 mgs per mil. A lot of times clients can. So if the Primo option is a problem, a split of Primo Master on to lower the shot dose would be the first move on that side. But then potentially, if that's not the option and then using the AI, it's absolutely something in a coaching situation that could happen. And I think that's the point, because I posed that question because your argument of like estrogen versus DHT and blocking one versus the other is kind of where I started that answer. But the final piece of the answer to me is coaching adherence and client adherence within a coaching process. And I just do find that client adherence with tests and taking the AI versus splitting that between tests and a DHT derivative, the adherence is easier on the injectables only side versus the pill, which is kind of like the point that you made earlier. And so this is where like the on paper pros cons versus the coaches pros cons have to kind of start to line up with each case that you're handling, because there are going to be cases where the readily available easy access test AI combo is going to be the one that you have to go with. But on the same flip side, we might have some issues with adherence that leads to fluctuations in baseline serum levels, which is going to make managing it a little bit more complex for you. So this is the piece that I think is the hardest portion to understand, is like when we look at this pros cons list, there's never the right answer on paper is the right answer for the client, because there's so many different variations of the problem that's going to come up that's going to keep you from what the ideal on paper to me is.
No, that's very true. I think with the biggest issue we run into with cycle designs is managing side effects and health markers. So,
yeah,
this was eventually is what that conversation comes down to. The other, before I get to like, that's all nearly getting to a final thought, but with the con around utilizing like a Masteron or Primobolan would also be sourcing, is because you brought that up. Like, hey, I can get 200 mg per mil masked. It's like, well, is that 200 mg per mil masked? Like Masteron is not a farm grade drug. It's all UG what you get. So like it could be underdosed. It could be boldenone very well. So there is like that problem that comes about versus just using testosterone and the AI and driving that up. But again, at some point to get more advanced, you're going to have to add in another compound to fill that role. Right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, with that being said, I guess that does come down to, the other coaching piece around this is that managing the water aspect, I think from an off-season standpoint, is an essential part to making sure someone's not just getting too soft in the off season and gaining fat. And with higher test cycles and poor estradiol management, or you could go the other way too, with just, with test and Master Primo combined. But I do find like high test only, there's more margin for error in having someone get more watery on that, versus you already found their existing testosterone tolerable amount and you've seen that reaction, and then you're just filling in the remainder with Primo Mast or whatever you choose to do, boldenone or nandrolone or something. Could be its own problems there, but and really like that is truth to conversation. Like your secondary compound in the off season, usually there's like 4 compounds to choose from. We see that people do choose. A lot of times Primo and Mast just make a lot of sense. I know we get a lot of shit about Masteron not being anabolic, but there's no such a lack of study that apply there. And like with J3U coaching, we have over 500 clients and all use our approaches with a lot of Mast, and they grow stupid. So the anecdotal is just so profound, I can't deny it. But anyway, with those compound choices, it's all could be problematic with like cycle design of getting access to quality gear. But I see with those, like at least within the boldenone Mast Primo, is that you can manage water at a much easier bout. And you brought up a question earlier, Luke, about someone had used an AI previously. Like I have some more advanced guys that come to me from past coaches that, hey, this is the test I ran. I ran an AI and I used this XYZ drug with it. it's like, how do you go about from adjusting them from there if they've always used this AI? And usually that's the adjustment that I do make, and I can manage them much more effectively, make sure optimize estradiol with like, usually it's like a 50% test cut with no AI, and filling in the total milligram amount right off the bat to where we're still in a productive rate for growth without trying to figure it out. Like, start with test and you only use test only. Like, no. That's not what you do with an advanced guy.
That's not what you do with this. God, that's like soapbox material for me, man. I get so frustrated. Like, and it's just people who haven't gone through the process of coaching these more experienced athletes, but you don't have time in someone's process when they're coming from a coaching environment that did that to go through the testosterone testing to find the ideal test dose. Like, you got to get them being productive when those milligram amounts get those high, and you have to err on the safe side of the test dosing and then move that up as they can tolerate it as you get through the process. It's just like, you're paid for results, not like to run a lab, right? So it's kind of, you got to find that nice balance between the two.
Yeah, I have some big guys I coach now on 3-ish grams or more that come to me with, here's my cycle design that's still around that milligram amount. It's like, okay, we're still going to have to run something around that because there's no more variables left to play. But we can adjust it to also go with lower test and no AI, or some AI and more milligram amount, just based on like their responses and what they do need. So there is a way to go about it. But with your advanced guys, like, you don't go through like, I'm a beginner framework of moving testosterone up every eight weeks, because you're never going to get there with these guys. So that's, but in the experiences I had, all the guys that I've moved to like managing tests without the AI, man, they've felt better in the off season. Like, they perform better. Their sleep's improved. Like, they're not holding a bunch of water anymore. So it has been more fruitful in that sense. But again, I think we're kind of wrapping this over and over back to this last final point of a conversation, is that, eventually your cycle design truly just does come to filling in your total milligram amount that you need to grow. And the thing here is that you do need enough testosterone present to fill in that optimal estradiol amount. And that's the point where you just have to control. And whether that control comes from lower test and filling in the rest with DHT derivative or something, or higher, like test and AI, like, you still have to stay at that estradiol level. And when you move it too low, that's when it's going to be problematic from a health perspective and also limiting your progress. Then from there, like, to meet that total milligram amount, those compounds you're picking should be the ones that can manage your health the best, so you can actually see out continued progress over months of time. And that's really the summation of where this comes into and how you want to get there. Like, if you like high test and you notice it's something from you, I am not going to take that away from you, say you're not, because I've seen conversations with people, my clients, where they hate Masteron, and they hate Primo, or they don't like Nandrolone, or, the side effects come up with this compound, not this compound. And that is, the differences is in inter-individual variability is present. So what this comes down to is just picking that compound based on how that person responds and managing their health and what's within their risk profile to see out that result. And is the AI a thing to be utilized? And like, it's a tool. Like, all these things are tool use. They're not must-haves. So, you could bring these things in when you need to manage estradiol, where things creep up as they do. But it's not likely something that we shouldn't be living on either. So you should have times where you're not needing to use an AI and coming back closer to a physiological norm.
Yeah, and I think that wraps it for us, man. I really think like the in-depth, detailed framework of working through that is really well laid out in level 1. But I mean, I think that hits all the points.
No, it does. And if there is a few missing, they're definitely in level 1, because that's where sit here and like really, sketch it out for you. And if you're curious around, if you're starting out, how would you escalate that up? Or if you are advanced and you're trying to figure out your cycles and you're looking at, why am I using XYZ compounds that was given to you? And you want to find out how to build out, what is my test needed in my response? And what is the next secondary compound that I should be utilizing? And what's that response and dosage? Like, that's what I lay out and we both lay out in level 1 to understand that. And then you have rationale and personalization to your cycles, and not just a copy paste cycle that was passed on and on and on. And what you might have very well been passed on was a high test AI SERM cycle that you start right out the gate without reason or assessment of yourself, which is not the way that it should go. The same thing goes, and I would be upset if I was given a workout that was given to some other pro that didn't look at my needs on stage, where I responded to my previous training program, what's my current response to my training program. But they're like, here, no, you do this workout because that's what worked for Ronnie Coleman. It's like, well, that might not work for me. Shouldn't there be more personalization or whys behind what I'm doing? Like, yes, the same thing should happen for your PEDs, your cycle design, and that is coaching. And so that is what we teach. So if you want to learn more, jump into level 1. That's where we cover it. And we'll leave it off there, guys. Thank you all for tuning in. Talk to you next time.